This does not mean, however, that socialism is dead. I want to continue to argue that socialism lives, but it lives as a kind of neurosis in the minds of Western intellectuals. Socialism has very little reality outside of that. It is, to borrow a phrase from Marx, the opiate of the Western intellectual. George Bush was at Moscow University recently, and he noted with some surprise that Marx was no longer required reading, to which one of his aides said, "Oh yes, but it's still big at Stanford." And dissidents who have come from the Eastern Bloc frequently remark, there aren't any socialists left in Poland. There aren't any socialists left in Hungary. There aren't any socialists left in Czechoslovakia. To find a socialist, you really have to go to the Sorbonne. You really have to go to Yale. In order to try to take a kind of inventory of socialism, I suppose what we should do is ask the socialists, what better example, after all, of socialism than the union movement Solidarity, which started out as a powerfully, self-consciously socialist movement, seeking to reform what it viewed as the perversion of socialism. And this, of course, is part of a long, somewhat sorry chapter of socialism wreaking debris around the world and reformers coming along to discover somewhere in that haystack the needle of true socialism. But now even Solidarity has, having won its election, having come to prominence in the Polish parliament, said no. Lech Walesa has said, socialism has made us the beggars of Europe. And Boris Yeltsin, coming to the United States from the Soviet Union, has some amazing things to say. He went, as many of you probably read, to a Korean grocery store, and he was shocked. He said, my gosh, I cannot even imagine all these products. Where would we have these in the Soviet Union? When Gorbachev came to the United States with his delegation, I read an article in the style section where some of his aides went shopping in some of the video stores and some of the grocery stores in Washington. And one of the questions they kept asking the store owners was, what's the limit? And the store owner said, the limit of what? They kept saying, well, what's the limit to what we can buy? And the store owner said, well, there's no limit. Buy anything you want as long as you pay for it. This to them was news. This was shocking. Socialism around the world has meant ration cards, long lines, misery, petty bureaucrats. It's hard for us really to visualize it very clearly. I suppose it's a kind of country run by the post office, where a kind of bungling and somewhat, not necessarily ill-meaning, but a bungling ineptitude kind of controls everything. Socialism certainly has been tried, and it's certainly been tried by smart people, and it hasn't worked. Why hasn't it worked? The reason, I think, is fairly simple. I think as human beings, we are motivated by a desire to better ourselves, a desire for gain, if you will, a desire to own property. These urges, as John Locke said, are no less natural than our sexual drive. These are our natural impulses. This is not to say that society should simply accept or transmit these impulses uncontrolled. What society tends to do is domesticate these impulses for what one may call the public good. For example, the institution of marriage is in some sense a taming of the sex drive. It is a way of channeling the sex drive into a socially constructive, stable, useful function. What the free market does is it takes our desire for betterment, for gain, and it gives it a healthy, productive, socially useful, and just order. Certainly one that is more just, more useful, more efficient than any alternative that has been not necessarily imagined, but tried. The main grievance against capitalism is inequality. And yet what socialism does is, if it does create equality, a kind of equality of misery. In practice, of course, we know that socialist countries don't generate very much equality at all. They create what one may call a permanent underclass for everybody, and then a small aristocratic class. The great feature of capitalist economies is the strength and integrity of the middle class, with the numbers of the rich and the poor being relatively small compared to the middle class. Why do intellectuals like socialism? Because, although in theory it's the proletariat, it's the people, it's the masses who rule, in practice, in socialist regimes, somebody has got to do the planning. Somebody has got to decide what gets produced and how it gets distributed. And very often it is the hope, sometimes a faint hope, of the intellectual that he will be selected to make these decisions. He will form a kind of nomenclatura. And so even when socialist regimes like Ethiopia decimate the countryside, generate enormous famines, the elite live very well. And during the height of the Ethiopian famine, Ethiopian officials were building lavish stadia, digging in swimming pools, and so on. Some of it with our money, by the way. So the paradox we have is that the socialist intellectual is, in a sense, attracted by the power that he would, the power and the gains and the tremendous material benefits that he would have under a socialist regime, while at the same time denying or deploring those motives in average people under capitalist regimes. In other words, it's very unhealthy and contemptible for you and me to want to own a car or to try to speed up cooking with a microwave. Those motives are bad. We should not be motivated by self-gain. But in a socialist regime, the socialist intellectual, often, though not always, sometimes in communist regimes, intellectuals of this stripe who help to usher in the utopia are then hunted down and massacred. Growing up in India, which is what one may call a soft socialist regime, the government doesn't own all the means of production, but it does own all the means of communication, the television stations and so on. I was able to see little vignettes of how socialism can be quite difficult, not only as an economic system, but also as a way to protect other liberties, freedom of the press, democracy, so on. To give you an example, India does have an independent press. People own their own newspapers. But in a system where the government owns the means of production, which I think we'd have to agree is a working definition of socialism, the state owns the means of production. In such a system, in India, the government owns and provides newspapers with newsprint. Since the government owns major industries, newspapers rely on the government for advertising. Consequently, the government has tremendous leverage on the free press. The free press is not able to say anything it wants, or at least it feels a kind of leash. And if the press begins to take on the government in too severe a fashion, all kinds of repercussions ensue. And so one begins to see, in I think a somewhat non-obvious way, that economic freedom is connected with the freedom to speak your mind. If the government owns the means of production, it's very difficult to publish a free newspaper. It's very difficult to own a printing press.